I'm here today with Reverend Molly Baskette. Molly is, in no particular order, a mother, spouse, recovering workaholic, cancer survivor, adventurous home cook, and senior minister of First Church Berkeley UCC in Berkeley, California. Nicknamed the Motley Pew for its tendency to make seatmates of purple-haired trans activists and Nobel laureates. That's got to be a great church. All of her books were written as a result of on-the-job training. Radical Church Renewal, as she helped her previous church, First Church of Somerville, out of a numerical and financial nosedive, or The Art of Public Confession, as she came to terms with her own vulnerability and embraced her shadow side, or Spiritual Parenting, that doesn't leave science and empirical research behind. But we're here today to talk about her new book, How to Begin When Your World is Ending, which is a spiritual guide to post-traumatic growth and joy. You can learn about all of Molly's work at mollybaskette.com. So, Molly, welcome to the interview, and congratulations on all of your work.
Thank you, Brian. It's delightful to be here.
So I like to start off by asking people, what else would you like people to know about you than what I touched on?
Oh gosh, well, you covered a lot. What else do I want to say about myself? Lifelong UCC or Cradle UCC, which is, fairly rare. A lot of UCC is a big tent, and there's a lot of refugees from other places in the denominational world, as well as people of no faith finding their way. Lifelong New Englander until I moved to California 6.5 years ago, and love being bi-coastal. When I'm here in California, I'm home, and when I go back to Boston, where I was last week, I'm home. So
Yeah, I
there's
was going
something
to
to be
ask you
said
about
for
that.
both.
I was going to ask
Yeah.
you about that a little bit because, I love both those areas myself, even though I don't live in either one of them.
Yeah. I
What
saw
was
you
it
in
like for you?
Boston recently.
Oh, I was, and
Yeah. It's
I
so
love it up
fun.
there. If I would have known what it was like when I was a younger kid, I probably would have moved there,
Yeah.
despite the
Yeah.
weather. But,
Yeah.
but what was it
Truly.
like, kind of making that transition?
For me, it was wonderful. When I first got here, all my prisoners, particularly the ones who were transplants themselves, said it's going to take, 2 to 3 years to settle in. You're really going to miss the change of seasons. The culture's really different. Maybe it's because I had family and friends here already, and we'd visit, pretty much every year, that I was just ready. Also, 45 New England winters, scraping like an inch of ice off the windshield. We did not have a fancy car with a remote starter for any of those winters. I was ready. And I was thinking about this yesterday, actually, like feeling really grateful for my time there, and how it forged me. Bostonians are known as the least friendly people in the country, or technically the meanest, which I find hard to believe. I think New
I do
Yorkers are
too.
probably a little meaner by necessity. It's like you're there with however, like 8 million people, and you need boundaries, right? To have any kind of like self. Um, but in Boston, I find like people might be a little frosty, but once they let you in, they let you all the way in. And those relationships are really stable and enduring. California is a bit more like floaty. It's very friendly. I made friends easily. I made friends across race and class and lots of other kinds of difference much more easily here than I did in Boston. So I cherish my really broad, diverse community here. But it's harder to like find the people who are really like who will show up, and they're going to show up. Um, and I wonder if that's a function of, kind of full sun culture, full sun spirituality here. Free to be you and me, and needing to stay loose and a little more rootless, or that sort of like westward expansion spirit, or the entrepreneurial spirit where like you go hard at a thing and then you abandon it and you go hard at another thing. So I don't know, but I feel very grateful. It's both places are so beautiful in different ways. I'm constantly awed by the majesty of California. And I love, one of my favorite things about Californians is they're not jaded about the weather or the natural beauty. Like every single day they're like, it's such a beautiful day, like with ridiculous verve. I'm like,
That's
it's
pretty
just
cool.
like yesterday, but they never get tired of it. Neither do I.
That's really good to hear, actually, because for a lot of folks in a lot of areas, I think they kind of take it for granted after a while.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Well, it's true that we're weather wimps. Like we can only handle weather within like a 12-degree range. Like today it's going to be 58 and that's cold, man. But if it's like over 82, forget it. We're sweating.
That's so funny.
Um, yeah.
So before we get into the new book, you've written several great books already. Can you just talk
Yeah.
a little bit about those?
Sure. I tend to write the books I need. Writing for me is catharsis. It's a way I make meaning of my world. It's a way you can't square everything. You don't make everything come right, but it's like storytelling for ourselves is very healing. There's actually some scientific research about trauma survivors and learning how to tell their story differently, not to make up an alternate reality, but just to integrate. And so the first two books I wrote were actually grief workbooks for kids. And I had found a grief workbook written by a Jewish psychologist for Jewish children that was absolutely stunning. And I asked her if we could, I actually cut and pasted, this is the older days. This is like 1999 for some kids in my church who had experienced grief, losing grandparents. And so then that publisher contracted us to do a workbook for kids, for Christian kids, and then a spiritual workbook for all kids for pet loss. Um, and then I had a long hiatus when I was just busy being a young mom and working. And then I was in Somerville helping that wonderful community group effort kind of turn our church around. And I found that a lot of pastors and lay folks from other churches were saying, what was the one thing you did, as we started to kind of get some buzz around having young people in worship or turning around our finances. And I said, can I take you to coffee? I was like, first of all, I don't have time for all those coffees. Second of all, it wasn't one thing. It was like 200 things. So I wrote them all down as a PDF and I thought I'd just sort of send that out and like, give me $10 to donate to my church. And I had been writing devotionals for the UCC, the UCC Daily Devotionals, and the editor for those was the editor of Pilgrim Press, the oldest press in America, oldest publishing house in America. And she said, let's turn this into a book. So that became Real Good Church, which I think came at a good pain point for lots of pastors and churches experiencing decline. And that led me to focus on the one thing that I really thought was the most effective and beautiful thing our church did, which was our weekly practice of testimony, of confessing our sins publicly and receiving grace from God embodied in the congregation. Again, how storytelling can help us kind of swim to the surface or mine our own hearts or look at our shadow side. And that book became Standing Naked Before God. Also an anthology of a lot of the testimonies that people gave. And then came the parenting book because I was parenting children, then tweens and teens, and collaborated with a friend of mine who was a member of my church, a really gifted child psychologist, from the faith and the spirituality and the science angle, and how those things, meshed and merged, and how they corroborated each other, science and faith not in conflict, but actually in concert, in communion, if you will. And then How to Begin When Your World is Ending, which started as a cancer blog when I was in treatment 10 years ago, 11 years ago, and a private journal, the things I couldn't say out loud. And then over time became a cancer memoir, and then really expanded to become a story, sort of a multiplicity of stories of people who have survived lots of different things and risen from their own ashes, resurrected, gorgeous, understanding God to be so present in their lives, risen like Jesus with his wounds, and putting those wounds into the service of others to make life a little bit easier for someone going through their own hard times, shining a light for them down the path.
So as I mentioned, the title of the new book is, How to Begin When Your World is Ending. The subtitle is A Spiritual Field Guide to Joy Despite Everything. So was that book really intended for people that are going through some serious type of trauma?
I mean, I think it's for anyone, honestly. We're all, it's very rare that we're all at a moment of perfect equilibrium, right? And equanimity and joy. And we also understand my sermon for the Sunday at church is going to be called Foreboding Joy. I've just been reading Brene Brown's excellent Atlas of the Heart, and she speaks of foreboding joy as something that most of us experience, which is that even when life is good, we're always rehearsing what's going to go wrong next. And that makes it really hard to appreciate where we are right now. So I think that even when life is easy, we're scared we're going to lose it. We're scared, like if you're a parent, you're scared your kid's going to get in a car wreck or a bike wreck or get cancer. Like we were just speaking of your grandchild. You don't have to have kids to feel so vulnerable. So I really think it's for everyone. There's a lot of specific stories in the book about people who have treatment-resistant depression, people who have completed suicide and their spouse's grief, their surviving spouse's grief, cancer, chronic illnesses, um, all kinds of mental health disorders, people who have been incarcerated for things they actually did, decent, decent. I don't like that word decent. It's so coded. I like to say we're all good and bad, all mixed together. And the two people I accompanied through incarceration are good and bad all mixed together. They're very dear, wonderful, faithful people who did terrible, terrible things, and who are aware of the harm that they did. And rather than deny or dissociate, they faced it squarely and they grew from those experiences. So I think there's so much here for every pregnancy loss. I talk about my miscarriages, talk about my vocation, when I learned that God wanted me to be a pastor, and there was joy in that, but also a lot of grief and loss for me and for other people, So I think it's for anyone, anytime. And I don't really like to toot my own horn, but a number of people I trust have said that it's also funny. So there's that too. So it's not just like doom and gloom and then, precious, precious quotes, written in cursive writing. It's real, it's real. And for me, my sort of alter ego, or I guess not alter ego because it's who I am all the time, is a doomsday Pollyanna. So, even in the midst of distress, we have to dance, we have to breathe, and we have to laugh, and laughter, in fact, can subvert a lot of it can help us let go of stress. When we can laugh at our enemies, whoever our enemies are, whether they're internal or external, whether it's, like fascist coup or our own inner critic, when we can laugh, it liberates us.
Well, Frederick Buechner wrote a lot about we're all sinners and saints, right?
Yes, he's
You're
one of
a
my
saint.
huge influences. Yeah. And I quote him in the book too.
Cool, cool. So you wrote this, as a pastor, I have walked with a number of people through their hard seasons, illness, incarceration, violence, PTSD, suicidality, and yet I've seen them all rise from those ashes and go on in gorgeous ways. I mean, does that kind of summarize the theme of the book?
Yeah, I think it does. So there's all those little stories. And then there's the arc of my own story, which, spoiler alert, I got to live. So it's a happy ending so far. Um, but all those stories are told with purpose. So each chapter, like I joke that I write all my books as bathroom books because I know that, we're also busy. So, you can sit and read a chapter or even a part of a chapter and get a takeaway out of it. So each chapter is sort of an essay on a particular theological theme. So one theme is God didn't send the disaster, but God will use the disaster. One is Life is Love School, which I stole from Richard Rohr. One is Losers for Jesus, when Jesus said, lose your life to find it. One is God doesn't have a plan, but God has a dream. So, kind of undermining that theology that says like, oh, it's all good. God's got a plan. God's got this. God doesn't give us more than we can handle. That's not, we know
All the
that
bad
life,
advice.
all that bad advice, Kate Bowler is amazing.
Yeah.
Everything happens for a reason, and other lies I've loved. You don't have to live truthfully for very long to know that theology doesn't work. It's just not true. Why do some 4-year-olds who get cancer live and others die? Why did I get to live? I don't believe that I was any more deserving than any other person who has cancer at age 39 with a 4 and an 8-year-old. It just doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I'd like to read a couple of the endorsements for the book. This is
Sure.
one from Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg. Is that how you pronounce her name?
Yep.
She says, your brain, heart, and soul will be better off for having spent some time in Molly Baskette's extraordinary company. So how do you feel that readers will be better off?
How do I feel the readers will
Yeah,
be better off?
yeah.
You're asking me. Well, I've already heard from a number of readers, some of them people I know from my book launch team, and others people who, pre-ordered and got their book early and have already written reviews or written me that um, it's helping them metabolize their own grief and trauma from lots of different parts of their lives. Um, they've dog-eared pages, they've gotten a highlighter and they have things they can return to again and again when they're experiencing a dark night of the soul or have tunnel vision or spinning out. Because, it's so hard in those moments when the rational brain is out to lunch and you're living like fully in your reptilian brain. And it's just very hard to ground yourself. I mean, of course, there's like great tools from both from contemplative Christianity and other contemplative faiths and, dialectical behavioral therapy about ways to ground yourself. That can immediately calm the body. But I think what I'm trying to offer is sort of a holistic understanding of the way in which a God who is truly liberative might work in a world where really horrible things still happen. Like, what does it mean? The original title of the book was going to be God is Not an Asshole, which a lot of people loved, but my editor, agent, and publisher were not among them. So we found a new title. But it's like, how do you, when you're spinning out, how do you pray? How do you square your reality that is so challenging with a good God? Because what you really need in those moments is a good God. And it's okay to yell and scream at that God and to call that God an asshole. God's been called a lot worse and really often, since God invented us, since God created us. So, yeah, I like to think of it. I hope it'll become, a pastor in people's pockets, something they turn to again and again when they forget
Mm-hmm.
how to when they forget how to believe or when they need someone to believe for them. Because that's something I tell people a lot to people in my church when they're going through something really hard and it really shakes their faith. I say, I'll believe for you until you can believe again. I'll pray for you until you can pray again.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. So here's an endorsement I really like from our friend Brian McLaren. He says, if you like to read beautifully written chapters that are every bit as funny as they are wise, that's reason enough to read How to Begin When Your World is Ending, a gift and a delight. So, he certainly picked up on the humor that you've, inserted in the book and appreciates that. But he also says, how did you seek to have beautifully written chapters? A lot of our audience are writers, right? So
Yeah.
you talk a little bit about, kind of how you achieve that.
Sure. I mean, I think I can. First of all, Brian McLaren, such a love, like such a lovely, lovely human. And like even when I was less known than I am now, which is probably not all that known, he endorsed he endorsed Standing Naked Before God and he's just such a champion of new writers and all writers and uses the platform he has to lift other people up. So I so appreciate him. Shout out, Brian.
Yay.
Um, Beauty. So, I always wanted to be a writer since I was a little kid. I didn't know how that would happen because it turns out I wasn't very good at writing fiction, which, when you're a kid, that's what writing is. Like I was a prolific reader. I like go to the library every Thursday and come home with like 20 books and like lie in bed, cuddle up all day and read. Books were my refuge from a lot of, difficulty when I was a kid. I grew up in a house with a lot of poverty, mental health mental illness and addiction.
Mm.
So books made safe worlds for me. Then I became a pastor. Well, it turns out pastors do a lot of writing. And it turns out doing a lot of writing makes you a better writer, especially if you're open to critique, which congregations are happy to offer every week, right? Um, and just the act of writing, it's like putting in your 10,000 hours. Malcolm Gladwell, you do get better at things. I mean, I think there are people who have a lot of native talent, but a lot of us have to just work really hard at things. I was blessed in the writing of this book to have a couple different writing refuges. My friend Lisa has a lovely backyard just a couple miles away from me with a yellow lab and just outdoor space heater. So COVID times, like I was there with her
Wow.
puppy and the heater and my brain. Another friend has a tiny house up in Sonoma that I would visit for like 3 days at a time and like really hunker down. So I could really spend time with the words and vet them and say, is this true? Is this, is this something, if I didn't know me, would this help me?
Mm.
Um, and editors are fantastic creatures, right? So my editor, Lil Copan from Broadleaf Books, a few friends who read it carefully, including a really dear friend who read it as a sensitivity reader,
Mm.
to help me see what I couldn't see, to help me trim my words, because I can be a little verbose. Just they help make it better.
Mm. Well, let's talk about Broadleaf Books. We were doing that
Yeah.
before we started the interview, and Lil has been a friend and colleague of mine for several years now, and I've just been so impressed with what Broadleaf has been doing. Can you talk about what your experience was like working with them?
Sure. I love them. This is my first book with them. Um, I've worked with, I'm going to forget their name, the Grief Workbooks. They were in Vermont, Spiritual Publishing House. Okay. Then Pilgrim Press for my next two books. Then we got kind of a lucky break. We have an amazing agent, my co-author for Bless This Mess, Ellen and I, who got us a deal with Convergent, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. Had an incredible editor there. Really interesting experience working with a big five publisher. But then my agent got found, well, Broadleaf and my agent found each other and they picked up How to Begin. And it's just been a lot of fun. They're a new imprint of a very long-standing publisher, 1517. They've been around, Lutheran publisher, been around a long time, but this is a very fresh publishing house or imprint. Very young and young staff, like young in age and young sensibility, really looking for a lot of new talent, particularly marginalized people, new voices, radical voices. I'm probably one of their less radical voices, in spite of the fact that I wanted to call my book God is Not an Asshole, and very skilled. It's really fun, been a lot of fun to work with them.
Good, good. I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
So I know you're just in the middle of launching this book, but are there any future books that you're able to talk about?
Sure. The second to last chapter of the book is called Church on Fire, and it's a reference to the fact that the church I serve in Berkeley, California, burned down on my 5-month anniversary. We
Mm.
had like I don't even know how many alarms fire. It destroyed our south wing. It took out a lot of the sanctuary. Um, and a lot of other really terrible things happened to me or to people I love in my close circle around the same time. Um, and it taught me a lot about resiliency and systemic change. My church had some pretty painful conflict after that fire took us out, as I and others in the church were trying to lead us in some new directions. There was a lot of grief at work, and the grief unfortunately made some people act out in really destructive ways.
Mm.
And we worked through it. So, you know, if I write this book, it'll be a book for pastors and lay leaders of churches, or maybe really anyone working in organizations that are experiencing decline or high conflict or feeling stuck, to help them understand how to recast, how to communicate, how to work through grief, how to surface old grief that has nothing to do with the current situation for systemic change. Or how to grieve and let go of the institution. I've been at my church for 6 years, and there's a lot that's really working well and going great. And I still have some really big questions about whether the Christian church is going to survive in a form that is recognizable. Like
Mhm.
this might have to all go away, or like almost all go away, like really kind of go underground and reemerge as Christ unrecognizable, even to his closest friends. I don't know. So that's a book I might write. A book I will almost certainly write, but probably not for a few years, is for my next act. Or really part of my current act as a pastor. This is why I feel so compelled to do it. I plan to get trained as a psychedelic chaplain. So there's a whole new emerging movement using psychedelics and a kind of adjacent drugs such as ketamine and MDMA to help people heal from treatment-resistant depression, addiction, PTSD,
Mm.
fear of dying if they have a terminal illness and they're afraid to die. And I'm so excited to learn how to do this work. You work with someone with one of these conditions. You make sure they're a good candidate. You do some sort of intake interviewing and establishing trust. Then you sit with them while they're under the influence of these high doses of these
Mm.
substances.
Mm.
And then a few days later, you help them integrate what they learn so it becomes part of their, operating system, part of how their brain works, new neural connections going
Wow.
forward. And there's some amazing reports out there. People say it's like one mushroom trip is like 3 years of therapy.
Wow. Huh.
I love being a pastor. I love
Fascinating.
walking with people through hard times. But one of the things that is very hard for me, I've been a pastor, I've been a student minister or a minister for 30 years now. And there are some people I just can't help, and it's not that they're fundamentally broken, but what they've been through or the way their brain works is too much. It's just too much. And prayer and good pastoral care and church, Christian worship, whatever is not enough for them. But these substances have real potential
Mm.
within the right setting, with attention to set and setting is some of the lingo, to really help people make a huge spiritual and emotional leap forward.
Mm.
So
Wow.
I'd love to write about that, both to demystify it and destigmatize it, and with permission, of course, to tell stories of people I've worked with and their
Mhm.
own transcendence.
Wow, that's a really fascinating area that I'm not very familiar with. I'm sure a lot of folks aren't. You
Yeah.
mentioned getting trained in it. What type of training exists
There's
for that?
yeah, there's a bunch of different programs. The one I'm looking at, because it's close to home, is UC Berkeley, which is in my backyard, has partnered with the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley
Hmm.
to train not just clergy, but all kinds of people, including, therapists and hospital workers and social workers and all kinds of people, because they really want a broad variety of people to get access to this healing work, and not just have it. There's a real risk of either big pharma taking over and making money off of it, and putting up sort of paywalls, or it becoming kind of the province of wealthy white people who can like pay out of pocket, or make a case for themselves to get these when other people are denied these experiences. So UC Berkeley and GTU are really trying to keep a really broad equity lens on it. But there's I would say dozens of programs at this point, and in the next like 2 to 3 years, as more of these substances that are in FDA trials now come out of trial, or as the FDA, as the government, either state, local, or federal government, decriminalize or actually legalize them, you're going to see an explosion in the
Mm.
movement.
Mm. Wow, that's really interesting. Very
It
good.
is. It's
I mean,
really interesting.
it
Yeah.
sounds like something I want to follow up with you on in the How to Heal Our Divides context
Yeah.
later on. So
Yeah.
thank you
Yeah.
for sharing that with
You
us.
bet.
We'll keep an eye out for a book or whatever else you do in that area. I'd really love to stay in touch on that.
Well, you'll know. You'll be in the know because I'll talk about it incessantly.
Good, good. So again, the title of this book, How to Begin When Your World is Ending. You can learn more at mollybaskette.com or from Broadleaf Books. Molly, thank you so much for your
Thanks,
work in this area
Brian.
and for
Thanks for
sharing it with
having
us
me on.
today.
You bet.